We are going to start today's presentation with a land acknowledgement. And, we recognize that we're coming together in a virtual space and that we may be physically located on different lands. And the land acknowledgement is really a recognition. It is a recognition that is meant to honor the indigenous peoples of these lands historically and presently, to call out colonization and white supremacy historically and presently, and also to express gratitude and appreciation for our individual and collective relationships with the lands on which we live and work. And we encourage you to take a moment to reflect on how you came to be on the land on which you live and work. And in the context of this conversation today, we invite you to think about the individual and shared histories of your own families, however you may define or experience family. I'm both a fourth generation settler of English descent and the granddaughter of Yugoslavian immigrants. I'm located in Toronto, the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations and covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. YouthREX's provincial office is located at York University. Both YouthREX and York University recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. The area known as Tkaronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Wendat, and the Métis. It is now home to many Indigenous peoples. We recognize the current treaty holders and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Thank you, everyone. We do have a full agenda. This is a bit of a longer webinar than we typically host at YouthREX, and so we've broken it into two parts. Following these introductions, we're going to have a performance followed by a fantastic keynote from our host and facilitator, Dr. Carol Wade, and then we're going to move into the first of two conversations. These conversations are going to include our fabulous guests today who have a variety of different perspectives, insights, and experiences. I do want to share, unfortunately, that Angie Morris is not able to join us today, but we do look forward to having our guests with us. And if you have questions during the conversations, feel free to share those questions in the chat box. There will be time for a Q&A after each conversation, at which time you could also ask your question live if you prefer. We're going to have a 10-minute wellness break. There's going to be space for us to have an interactive activity, and we're going to strive to end today by 3 o'clock. But as you know, with live events, anything can happen. And so we thank you in advance for your patience and flexibility. I'm going to share a little bit about YouthREX. For folks who are new to our project and our work, our vision is an Ontario where shared knowledge is transformed into positive impact for all youth. And our mission is to make research, evidence, and evaluation accessible and relevant to Ontario's youth sector through knowledge exchange, capacity building, and evaluation leadership. What does that mean? We curate and create resources to support your youth work practice. We have over 1,700 of these resources on YouthREX's Knowledge Hub, and we also create space for us to come together like today's webinar and through other events that we host. We also provide capacity building opportunities through our Learn by YouthREX program. We have an online learning platform that provides access to a variety of certificates and workshops for you to share your knowledge and to learn from others. And we also provide evaluation leadership and community engaged research opportunities. And we offer free supports to youth programs that need some specific mentoring or guidance around program design, development, and evaluation. So designing your program and then understanding its impacts. We encourage you to get in touch with us. All of our services and supports are free, but those customized supports can be really useful to programs that may have limited capacity, and we may want to build that in these areas. So again, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I am so excited to introduce our spoken word performance, Amoya Ray. Those of us who have participated in YouthREX events may have seen Ray perform. Ray is a Jamaican Canadian performance poet and 2018 Canadian national champion. Her writing is rooted in her lived experiences as an immigrant, mother, and community worker. Ray was crowned the 2021 Toronto Grand Slam champion, and her debut collection, funded by the Ontario Arts Council and the Canada Council for the Arts, is set for release in fall 2022. Welcome, Ray. We're so glad you could join us today.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you to the entire YouthREX team for creating this space and having me here. And I really am excited to listen to the conversations today. So I appreciate and I'm honored to be opening this event today. The piece that I'm going to be sharing was written for my own son after the summer of 2020, and it was also written for a youth that I was supporting and navigating their identity with their family and that difficult period for them. It's called Survive. When the child asks, what's the point of living if they just want to kill us all? This is my response. Somewhere right now, there is a mother waiting for a child to arrive. Somewhere right now, there is a mother praying to every God, wishing on every single star for a child to bloom, to unravel into a garden, honeysuckle and ghost flowers, lilies to line a wanting smile, to become the lush greenery that grows after a lifetime of hurricanes, to not just withstand the storm, but to become it, obliterate the wind scale. Mother Storm Chaser waits to witness the rhapsody of rising, to erupt from the depths a diamond, knows the pricelessness of rarities, wants the child gift wrapped in gold, wants the package to read fragile, handle with care, wants the shipping label to read, please return to sender, knows that the child might come home in pieces, but at least they will come home. And in this metaphor, you are the prized possession. So today you will survive for survival's sake. Today you will open your eyes and know that your body did not fail you. Today you will stretch your hands and grab at the sun. Be your own tender embrace. Intrusive thoughts melt from the warmth of it all. For each body that has wondered if they are enough, there is a mother who has already written your name on her heart, has already whispered your name to her ancestors. Somewhere, someone is asking questions when they themselves are already the answer. And yesterday might not have been enough to hold your entire story. So today, you might mumble through the lines, skip over the trigger words, and land on the pause. And there you will walk in the sun, past a fruit stand and squeeze for freshness, delight in the possibilities of growth, of your own sweetness. Today you will be joy. Glory be the spring that appears after the frost. Today you will clap when you land at your own reflection. You deserve all the applause and the accolades, but hold the acceptance speech and be still. Be still. For you are enough. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ray. Thank you. We always appreciate your willingness to share and to collaborate with us. Thank you so much for being with us today. We are now going to introduce our host and our keynote speaker for today's conversation, Carol Wade. Carol has over 23 years of experience in the child welfare sector and in social work education. She is currently a sessional instructor at the Schools of Social Work at the Universities of Windsor and York University. Her PhD dissertation focused on understanding the impact of historical trauma on current day parenting. She draws on this work in using critical theories and pedagogies to deconstruct and challenge oppressive practices to families and young people. So please join me in welcoming our host and facilitator for today's webinar, Dr. Carol Wade.
Thank you, Katie, for this introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to see so many of you here today. Some of the names and faces I recognize. And thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to be part of this important conversation on centering equity in family engagement. You're all most likely here because you work with equity deserving families on a regular basis. So I'm hoping that at the end of this conversation, that you walk away with some tools that you can incorporate into your practice. I am excited to be here, beyond excited, I should say, to be here in conversation with some amazing speakers who are doing excellent work in their respective fields, working with young people and their families. In this conversation with them, I'm hoping to draw on their experience capital and their practice knowledge to help us shift our practice. So, next slide, please. So, my name is Carol Wade. I am a Black woman. I am a parent. My ancestors originally are from West Africa, but was enslaved, or I should say imprisoned, as part of the slave trade on a beautiful small island in the Caribbean by the name of Montserrat. I am cisgendered. I am a parent of a child with dyslexia. These are the many things that shapes my identity. I have experienced racism. I have experienced sexism. I have had to navigate complex systems to address my child's dyslexia. In elementary school, I have experienced bullying. I was a tall and lanky kid, and I was the tallest in the school. I was called the CN Tower. I was asked, how's the weather up there? All of these experiences contributed to who I am today. All these experiences assist me in building resiliency despite experiencing some trauma. They were an asset in helping me to navigate the complex world also. Next slide. I open with this because as folks who provide services to equity deserving families, we must understand the multiple identities and the histories and experience of the families and young peoples we work with. In doing so, we're able to understand how traumatic experiences shape people's lives, and we can also understand the strengths and the assets of family and individual. So in centering equity in family engagement, I'm going to introduce you to the 4E model to offer you a tool to enhance your practice. So next slide. So what is this model? This model puts the voice of equity deserving family at the center of our work and intervention. Equity deserving families and individuals have been traumatized by the same systems that are supposed to be helping them. They have experienced multiple and generational oppression. Some of this oppression includes their constitutional rights being disregarded, which includes harsh treatment by systems, under and unemployment, lack of appropriate housing, difficulties accessing education and training opportunities, difficulty accessing services in the medical system, and the list of difficulties just goes on. They have also been denied the basic human rights, and equity deserving folks struggle for equality, and they experience feeling of disempowered in the very same systems that we all work in. And finally, the visible impact of racism, where equity deserving families are overrepresented in the child welfare system, in criminal justice system, and in special and remedial classes in the education system, which all leads to some psychological and emotional abuse that happens to them by the system. This is not new information. This information is highly documented to data and also to qualitative stories. These experiences leave equity deserving families traumatized, sometimes by the same system that are supposed to be helping them. I'm asking everyone on this webinar, what is your contribution to the trauma that equity deserving families and young people experiencing within your organization? Some folks' reaction may be, what is she talking about? My role, I help all my families. But guess what, folks? We continue to see overrepresentation. We continue to see parents fighting against oppression. We continue to see racist practice. And thus, I'm going to ask this question again. What is your contribution? What lens do you bring to work with equity deserving families? According to Paulo Freire, who's one of my heroes, he wrote the book, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. He indicated that people's worldview is manifested in practices representing the oppressive attitude present in society. So as such, this is where this model supports self-reflection and self-reflexivity practice. To use this model, which I'm going to introduce, you have to focus your attention inwardly to ensure that your biases and your personal values that may be embedded in racism, sexism, homophobia, ageism, genderism, and the list goes on. We have to ensure that our biases and values does not support racist and oppressive practices within the organizations we work. To use this model means that you have to check yourself at the door. This is a model that expects you to be genuine, that expects you to give up your power and control. Yes, for some of us who are given mandated power, it means that we have to set that power down. And we need to focus on working in equal partnership with young people, parents, and caregivers and their community. So I am going to pause for a moment. And part of this conversation is from learning from each other. So one of the questions that I'm going to ask, and I'll do this throughout my presentation, and I want you to use the chat box to share with each other and to learn from each other. So I encourage you not only to write in the chat box, but also to read what others are saying so you could also learn. So the question I have for you is how do you plan to bring awareness to your unconscious biases or conscious biases that may influence how you provide service to equity deserving families? So how do you bring your awareness of your unconscious bias or your conscious bias that it may influence how you provide service to equity deserving families? I'll just take a second and I'll read the chat to see what some of the ideas that people are putting in the chat. So I have a time limit, so I'm going to continue, but as people put in the chat, people write in the chat, thank you, Lish, educating others on implicit biases, stereotype, etc., so people can learn and perhaps call others, myself included, out. Perfect, thank you. Continue to reflect on this question, and as the answer comes to you, please put it in the chat. So the need for service providers to provide quality service to equity deserving families continue to grow. Next slide, please, sorry. It continues to grow, especially now in the world of COVID. COVID highlighted the inequities for families, and it's very crucial and necessary for us to do exemplary work with equity-seeking young people and their families. We can no longer be complacent and continue our traditional ways of doing business because it's not working, folks. Hear me. I am not saying that all our traditional practices have to be abandoned. What I'm saying is that equity-seeking families continue to be pushed further and further to the margins of society. Hence, we have no choice but to look at what is not working. The model moves away from using jargon words such as transformation or other words that are flavor of the day without action. Right now, if you're in the sector, you know everyone is reimagining things. So right now, everyone is talking about reimagining child welfare, reimagining intervention in young people's life, reimagine AOP practice, which is all good, don't get me wrong. But if you're working in the system long enough, you know that it takes years to reimagine and change things. And for me, that is not acceptable, as there is an urgency for equity deserving families. The need for you to do the right thing now. So while you're reimagining how you're changing lives, we need to be able to do something right now in the present to address the inequities that are faced by equity deserving families. So for example, COVID has forced me to reimagine my retirement. Well, part of me thinking about my retirement requires me to start immediately radically changing my spending behaviors. It is the same for our work. We need to start radically changing our practices immediately. And this is what the 4E framework offers you, a tool to immediately change your practice. This tool moves away from the abstract concepts to action-focused work, which includes mobilizing resources, motivating families, working collaboratively to challenge barriers to create the best possible outcome for families. There's a lot of critique on mainstream tools that we use in our assessments and in our daily work. These assessments often develop using a Eurocentric lens that are rife with biases. So until we imagine in our respective tools, yes, I said the word reimagine again, the 4Es can be used to support the tools you currently use in. Next slide, please. The 4Es are not words you never heard of before, but this model is focused on action and actually shift the focus from you as the expert in family's life to working as an equal team members and focus on understanding how to work with family effectively and most of all, take action. The model moves away from using a deficit lens in viewing family to an asset-based lens. And I'll talk more about this as I go along in terms of the asset-based lens. It is if you feel uncomfortable, if you get stumped in working with equity-seeking families, if you're feeling anxious and you find yourself using methods and tools that are not working, if you're relying on your agency policies to do your work, this is where the 4Es can be helpful in guiding your work and into a meaningful and effective thing for families. The model focused on the 4Es: exploration, expectation, education, and empowerment. We all know the meaning of these words. This model calling us to turn our gaze inwards in working with equity-deserving family. I will now give you an overview of each of these tenets and what they look like in action. And my guest speaker later on will also look at these tenets and what they look like in their practice. So as mentioned in the introduction, I've been practicing in the social work field for over 25 years. I have experience working in various sectors, such as the youth sector and the child welfare sector. I completed my dissertation for my PhD on understanding the influence of historical trauma on current day parenting with a focus on Black Caribbean parents. This research was fundamental to me as I firsthand witnessed the adverse impact when professionals do not understand parenting within the context of historical or intergenerational trauma. So I'm going to rely on my findings from my dissertation to help deconstruct each of these 4Es. So I use dialogue circle as part of my methodology for my research, as it was a culturally effective way to gather participants' perception in a permissive and non-threatening settings. Parents and caregivers shared their own traumatic stories of racism and other forms of oppression that shape how they parented their children. They also shared how these experiences build their resilience and their skills in navigating complex situations. After analyzing my data from the dialogue circle, 4 principal themes emerged. These themes included parenting within the context of historical trauma, pervasive influence of racism on parenting, the family structure and understanding the different family structures and gender differences. And of course, the theme of resilience ran through the whole discussion. So I completed my research several years ago. And more recently, I was sharing my findings with Dr. Anucha, who is a research chair at York University. And she indicated to me that I cannot sit with these findings. It is my ethical obligation to actionize my findings to support equity-deserving families in my community. And as such, I adapted the 4E model as a knowledge to practice tool for centering the well-being of equity deserving family through strategic and meaningful engagement. So in discussing the 4Es, as I mentioned, for the purpose of this conversation, I'm going to rely on the narratives of my research participants who are Black and mainly from the Caribbean. So let's start off with the first E, which is exploration. So exploration is taking the opportunity to get to know families through conversations and observation, and by asking the right questions without passing judgment. The frustration of the Black parents in my dialogue circle came when people in the helping profession make assumptions about their families and about their parenting. In addition, in my professional experience, when plans are made for families to address issues without building on the family's knowledge and in integrating their voice in the plan, most of these plans failed. And as such, it is important to pay attention to Black families' funds of knowledge, which are culturally based practice resources. So when we talk about funds of knowledge can be identified through multiple approaches, including observing or asking about parenting practices. Again, don't assume. And also asking about parenting values. You have to be able to listen. And I repeat, listen, and do not make assumptions. And you have to consider how funds of knowledge maybe shape your perception of a child and family, as well as how this new knowledge can be integrated in your program activities. In the exploration phase, parents and caregivers' cultural wealth must be acknowledged. In my research, it was evident that Black parents have a lot of cultural capital. And based on the experience of racism and other forms of oppression, they have developed skills to maneuver the different oppressive systems. It was clear that they drew upon their cultural wealth to support the children. For example, they draw on their racial capital to navigate, manage, and resist racial marginalization and prepare their children to do the same. Using their navigational capital, which is the ability to maneuver through and manipulate institutions and practices that were designed to exclude them. In addition, by supporting Black young people to provide racial consciousness, they assist the ability to respond to racialized events. Again, going back to my experience working within this child welfare sector and other social sectors, and emerging out of my findings from my research, it is very important to be authentic in your engagement with families. It is very important to enter into conversations, not as an expert on their lives, but recognizing that families and individuals are experts on their own lives. Hence, the final phase of exploration is to ask young people and their families about their experiences with racism and oppression. I remember once giving a similar talk, and I asked a question about how many people in their clinical work with families asked about their racism and oppression. And it was really sad to say that it was less than 20% of people that was part of the talk asked about racism and oppression. We cannot do any type of clinical work with families, no matter what sectors you're in, without having a good understanding of how racism and oppression have influenced or shaped the person in front or the family in front of your lives. Ask about parenting practice, ask about parenting values. Transmitted values may include the values of education, respect, and responsibility. Acts about the influence of spirituality in the church. It's acts about the importance of their village, such as family members, elders, community, friends, and as I mentioned, the church. Remember that young people and families, they have communities that have a lot of cultural wealth and knowledge, and we really need to draw from that in terms of working with our families. I know that some of the parents in the group spoke about transmitting their values through storytelling. Some spoke about using the book of Proverbs in the Bible to help them instill values. Some spoke about using Anansi stories to teach children in a way that is culturally meaningful to them. I was reminded about an Aunt Nancy story in working. One of the things I want to know in doing my research, I learned so much about my culture that I really didn't know. So, and I started using some of the strategies that my participants spoke about in my own parenting today. So I'll give you an example of such. One of my child, were doing something, were watching something or did something that he thought was very funny. But I know that it's maybe funny now, but can have some significant consequences. And I found myself saying to them, what sweet nanny going to run his belly? So what sweet nanny goat is going to run his belly? That's a saying that is famous with Caribbean population. They were like, huh? And I was able to get their attention and explain to them that what sweet nanny goat going to run his belly is saying that what you might think that is funny now and okay right now might have really bad consequences. And as a parent, I can see that, but as a child, you cannot, right? And so I use that phase, that story, Nancy's story, as an opportunity to teach. Another saying that my research participants shared is, not everything good to eat is good to talk, which means not everything thought or your opinion need to be spoken out loud, as there could be consequences. And some things you need to just keep it under the wraps. And I find myself using some of these phases in my everyday parenting because it's so easy. They allow me to enter into really good discussion with my kids. So I want to pause right now for a second and ask, put in the chat, what are some of the cultural sayings that guide your practice from your culture? Whether it be a Nancy story, a different culture might have different saying that have messages in there around values and around parenting. So please feel free to use your chat and share some of those saying. And while you're doing that, I'll take a sip of water. So do not discount the stories of equity-seeking families. I remember saying something to my daughter, and she was, oh, Mom, that's old school. So let's not discount these stories that, oh, those are cultural practice. They have no relevance in our Canadian context, right? Because these are tools that really in my practice, I encourage parents to embrace these stories, right? And I remember speaking to one parent and we're just having a difficult time, I was having a difficult time engaging and understanding her parenting. And I asked about a Nancy story, and I was telling the joke about a Nancy story, one of the Nancy story. And then we entered into conversation, and she was able to share some of the stories that's guiding her parenting. And it was like a light bulb went off in me in terms of, okay, now I get it. Now I understand how you're parenting. And what you need to know is that a lot of equity-seeking people, they parent from a place of desperation, right? They parent because in a manner that because they're really scared about their children's future. And we really need to keep that in mind in terms of understanding different parenting styles and also in terms of engaging parents. Next slide, please. The second of the 4 E's is expectation. My research highlighted the number of stresses that are faced by equity-deserving families, including navigating this racism, the racism they face in the community and at work, having to work many jobs to make ends meet, having to work many jobs to support paying for treatment or to pay for services for their young people. The demands of parenting alone and their unrealistic expectation that are forced on equity-deserving families is really unbelievable. So what we have to really check, what is it our expectations are of our young people, of our families. We need to recognize the barriers that are present for parents. So sometimes we think that parents are not uncooperative, they're not attending service. But do we ever consider they may not have bus ticket, they may not have childcare? So we really need to ask questions of parents rather than assume, because I've heard conversations and negatively talking about parents when workers are having difficult conversation and engaging them. Rather than the worker looking internally towards what do I need to do to change the way I interact, we pass the blame onto the parents and start labeling them. So we need to create a culture in which parents are expected to be intentional and proactively engaged. We need to build a family's funds of knowledge, which I talked about, and engage families in ways that are responsive to their needs. We need to ask parents for feedback to better understanding their goals and preferred methods of engagement. And finally, we need to treat parents like valued partners and contributors, not as I'm the worker, I have all the knowledge, and I'm here to save you. So rather, you're switching the script to I'm here to work in partner with you. Next slide, please. The third of the four E's is education. In my dialogue circles, parents shared the trauma that they experienced within the education system and how they were streamlined into non-academic courses, not because they were not intelligent, but because they were Black. And they see the same thing that continue to happen to their children today. They spoke about the difficulties that their parents had in navigating the educational systems. And as such, it is important to recognize the impact of a history of exclusion that has barred families from participating in high quality education system. It's important to educate parents on how to navigate complex institutional and systems in order to ensure that they're able to advocate for their children. As you know, working with equity deserving families, they have to navigate so many systems. It's our duty as professionals to help them navigate this system, to help giving them the tools or at times walk beside them in navigating the system. It is important to engage in partnership within community and local agencies to share information, to support advocacy, and promote access to resources and networks. It is also important to ensure that families are connected to services and resources, but also to each other in order to build social capital and networks. Next slide, please. Empowerment is our final E that I would like to talk about. And just before I go into empowerment, in each of these areas, in my research, each of these could actually be a webinar in and of itself, on their own, sorry. So when I talk about empowerment, which is the final E, what impressed me in my dialogue service was the strength and the resiliency that the parents demonstrated. Despite the impacts of historical trauma and oppression, the narratives demonstrated agency and resilience. It was evidence that some of the residues of slavery still exist in participants' mind. However, they were insightful, and they shared a sense of urgency to protect and parent their children. Thus, as families continue to strive for success, empower them to be self-sufficient and equip them to deal with the challenges of parenting and life obstacles. Provide them with the tools to achieve their goals. Rather than doing it for the family, build on the family's assets and capacities. Educate them on issues around advocacy and networking, and finally, hold high expectation about their role as parents. Let parents and let young people and families know that they're valuable members of society. Let them know that you're proud of who they are, right? And they need to be strong. We really need to build and promote our families and our young people who are equity deserving, because actually promoting and building their overall spirituality, emotional well-being, and physical health really leads to the best outcome for these families. So I know I am a little bit over, but as I come to the end of my talk, it is pertinent for me to remind everyone that when working with young Black people, when working, with equity-seeking families, it is vital to understand that families are part of the working relation, that that you're in partnership with them. It is really important, and this is the part that I really want to emphasize. Right now, in a lot of sectors, it's all about centering the voices of young people. I absolutely get it. But it's really important to center the voices of young people and their parent or caregiver, because their voices can coexist at the center. And the young people need their parents and caregivers to be part of this support network. So, as I said, please, in your work, let us center the voices of young people and their parents, because their voices can coexist together at the center. Thank you for listening. And at this point, I am going to turn it, ask all the guests, put on the cameras. Thank you.
I think
And I see a hand that's up.
Sorry, Carol. I think at this point we're inviting Lorraine and Clovis and Cora to join for this first conversation.
Yes, thank you. Was there a hand that was up? I thought I saw a hand up somewhere, but okay, that's fine.
I was just clapping.
Okay, thank you. And I just want to take a moment just to go through the chat, because while I was talking, I didn't, lots of really good stuff here. I didn't have a chance to, so one of the questions was around cultural saying. A common saying within my Caribbean upbringing was, you don't hear will feel. Absolutely. Those who don't listen must feel. Oh, I hear that so many times. Empty barrels make the most noise. Teresa, do you mind talking a little bit about that? Never heard that.
Oh, it's a phrase from my grandmother. I grew up in Belize in Central America. And so my grandmother will often say that, meaning that children who are not willing to listen and learn are often the ones that are the most disruptive or the most noisy, if that be the case, you know. So she would use it kind of as a retort towards her grandchildren if we were too rambunctious or she felt we were too out of control.
Thank you for sharing that. And I'll just, wear out, don't rust out. A stitch in time saves 9. Carolyn, do you mind just sharing what that means?
Yeah, that wear out, don't rust out. My grandfather, on my father's side, is a German background. And that was apparently my great grandfather's favorite saying in German was wear out, don't rust out. So like work hard, don't just sit there and go rusty. And so that passed down to my grandmother, and she told us this is how, you know, the implication is when I was little is this was the favorite saying of my father, and so it was a guide for us. And the a stitch in time saves 9. That was probably from my mom's side. Literally, like if you let that tear in your pants, if you leave it untended, it's just going to get bigger. So deal with it right away.
Thank you for sharing that. You see how powerful these stories are, or these sayings are? This is what guide is, because I remember so much from my own upbringing that now, after doing my research, I'm like, why wasn't I bringing this back into my parenthood? So I started inserting every opportunity because I want to pass on that tradition to my kids, right? They're good values we're trying to build for our children. We want them to grow up to be healthy, ethical adults. So these are the things that help shape them. And these are some of the tools, like I'm hoping that ideas are starting to percolate in people's mind about how can we use some of these phrases to engage our families, right? So thank you everyone for sharing. And there's some very interesting one that I'm going to take note of and just look up. So, and it's really good to see that different cultures, we share similar upbringings, right? these stories help form us. And like, so you may look at me and see a Black woman, and then Carolyn here, who we all had stories who's from Germany. We all have stories that help us. So we probably have more in common than we don't have in common. And that's something that we need to recognize in the profession, right? So I'm going to pass it back to Katie. Sorry, Katie, there. I went off for script for a bit. And so
no, that was great. That was no, Carol, that was great. I'm so glad that folks have been sharing with us. This is a great dialogue, which is what we wanted this to be. But yeah, the first of two conversations, we're going to invite Lorraine and Clovis and Cora to turn on their cameras and their mics, and we'll make sure to spotlight everyone for this first conversation.
Okay, so I will turn it over to Clovis to introduce himself and what he just does, and why he is here to share some of his valuable experiences with us.
Well, thank you so much, Carolyn, for your amazing presentation. I too jotted down at least 3 quotes that I felt, wow, that's actually quite powerful. So, and I appreciate also some of the quotes you put in your slide, especially the one from James Baldwin. And just as a background, by day, I'm the CEO for a homeless youth organization here in New York region, which sits on Treaty 13. By night, I'm a parent, and I have 2 kids, one with autism, who's 25. And that is actually what I want to talk about here today. I'll use 3 words, and there's some great synergies between the work that I'm going to talk about and what Carol just spoke about just now with the 4 E's. So educate, enlighten, and empower. And that's the focus of Sawubona, Africentric circle of support. For too long, Black parents caring for a family member with a disability have felt many of the things that we've heard, feeling silenced in their parenting, ignored, that their voices didn't really matter, and that there was very little acknowledgement of their own unique needs. So my wife and I started this group for Black families in the fall of 2020, but really the seeds of it date back almost 20 years ago when our son, who's now 25, as I said, was diagnosed with autism at age 4. The lack of attention paid to race and disability has been something that certainly my wife has been talking about for many years as she attended one parent group after another. Very little attention has been paid to the intersection of race and disability. It's as if racism does not affect somebody who has a disability. Our experiences and those of families who have joined the group speaks to a very different reality. The impact of race and disability was there at the parent groups that were not frequented by many Black families. Why? As I said, Carol spoke about some of that today, but what we've seen is we've heard from one family after another about their experiences about feeling judged in their parenting at these groups, reluctance to share their struggles and their needs due to fears of being misunderstood, and really the ongoing risks of being reported to Children's Aid out of lack of understanding of their parenting. The lack of diversity in staff at mainstream organizations is another reality which contributes to a lack of trust. And the impact of race and disability is really an acute reality for young Black males who were profiled when going into a store because he does not look like he has a disability, and his behavioral idiosyncrasies make him a target for law enforcement. And I will speak squarely to that when I take my son, who is not very verbal, but you look at him, you don't realize that he does have a disability. And so the strange things, I guess people can view it as strange behaviors that he exhibits in the store, and you've got two Black people in a store walking up and down the aisles. Again, it's a reality that I've experienced, my son's experience, and other families experience. You know, it also exists when the school would focus on our Black son's behaviors and not on his potential. And Dr. Wade just spoke about the streaming, you know, preferring to stream him into lower functioning school programs than on what would highlight his strengths. You know, these were our experiences, and not just ours, but ones shared by many families we support. Sawubona is a Zulu word that means I see you, not in the literal sense of sight, but rather that these families being seen for who they are, their value and worth to community. You know, those of us raising or caring for a loved one with autism or any other disability really can understand the feeling of invisibility that our loved one experiences on a daily basis. You know, when you add in the additional barrier of race, socioeconomics, or family status, that invisibility feels magnified, and it's felt not just by the individual, but really the entire family. Through the work of Sawubona, our hope is to respond by ensuring that Black families feel not only seen, but heard, valued, included, and inspired. Through our bi-weekly groups, we bring resources to families. There is mentorship and learning from each other. And most importantly, there's dialogue, sharing about their experiences and developing strategies to amplify their voices. Through the work of Sawubona, we are saying to families that we see you, that your unique needs of supporting your child while having to navigate systems where anti-Black racism still exists and which negatively affect outcomes for them and their family member. So since the group began 16 months ago, we now have about 160 members from across the GTA in 4 provinces and in other parts of the world, including the US, UK, Caribbean. You know, the families tell us that they want and appreciate the safe spaces we have provided them, a community where they can come together and receive support as they deal with the loneliness and isolation that comes with raising a child with a disability. Sawubona, sorry, Sawubona is about these families and how, and you can see that there is strong alignment with the 4 E's, again, that Dr. Wade just spoke about. It's about creating a village. It's about helping them find their voices. It's about helping them have the courage to use their voice. It's helping them learn about resources and are connected to them. We're giving opportunities to improve outcomes for them and their family member to believe that they have agency to make a change to the status quo. Thank you for this opportunity to dialogue.
Thank you, Clovis. And I look forward to hearing more through our questions. Lorraine, can I pass it on to you to do an introduction of what you do?
Thank you so much, Carol. And I first want to say that I so much enjoyed your presentation today. I think I could sit and listen to you all day. So hopefully you'll send more opportunities to do so. I'm Lorraine Gale. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a white, cisgender, queer woman settler living in Toronto. I work at the Children's Aid Society of Toronto, and I coordinate the Out and Proud program there, which I've done for many years now. And so what I'm really interested in exploring is how do we, and in fact, do we work with families of 2S LGBTQ youth? I'm using that as an inclusive term that goes beyond just what those letters directly stand for. Because I think what tends to happen is that in the social service sector, we have some youth services set up, or we have some queer services set up that will support queer and trans youth who need support. And so a youth might come forward and say that, you know, they don't have much connection to community, and their family doesn't understand them, and they're feeling really alone and depressed. And so we'll link them up to services. We link them up to maybe a youth group and maybe some counseling. And we don't go back and explore what's happening with your family. How does your family understand who you are? and how and what are some of the struggles that your family is having to understand and support who you are. And so when we don't do that looping back to the families, and coming from the child welfare sector, you would think that we would, you know, our role is all about families, you know, and it's a very tricky role in terms of, you know, a long history of embedded white supremacy and anti-Black racism and racism and in anti-Indigenous racism embedded in the very foundations of our work. So we need to understand that as a child welfare sector, those of us in that sector, we have a very complicated relationship with so many equity deserving communities. But when we have a young person who says that their family doesn't understand and support their identity, what are we doing with them? And too often we don't know what to do. We might have a conversation with the family, and the family is, you know, quite opposed to their child's identity and wants us to take the child and fix the child for them. Or perhaps they're not so rejecting. They might be a family that, you know, is trying to be supportive, but really worries about their child's future and believes that, you know, this is just a phase, it's a choice. It's a choice that's going to bring worse outcomes for them and bad things. So it's really better if they choose differently, and I'm going to try and steer them on the right path because as a parent, they love their child. They want the best for their child. And we as a social service sector have really let families down. We don't know how to support families. As broadly speaking, obviously there are many exceptions, but we don't really know how to support families who are struggling to understand and accept and support their children's gender and sexual identities. And this gets particularly complicated when we're working with equity deserving families, where that those layers of historical and ongoing present day racism and oppression from within the child welfare sector and other sectors continue to impact those families. But when we don't have those conversations with equity deserving families, that often comes from certain beliefs that we don't really believe that rejecting families or even the ambivalent families can actually change. We think that once rejecting, that's it. Oh, that's really sad. You know, okay, young person, I'll get you linked up with some services. And we leave it there. We especially don't think that Indigenous, Black, and racialized families can make those changes to learn to understand their children's and support their children's identities better. If you ask a group of people, what racial community do you think is most supportive of their TUS LGBTQ children's identities? I bet the first response will not be Black families. And yet we have research from the US transgender study, now I've forgotten the name, which found that in fact it was Black families who were most supportive of their trans youth identities. And it was Black families who after a period of time were the strongest families compared to other racial categories. But when we walk with the assumption that Black families and Indigenous families and racialized families won't support their children's identities, then we don't take the time to ask those questions that Carol talked about, to explore with them, to find out what their fears and worries are and what their best hopes and dreams are for their children. And we do such a disservice to both the young people and the families. And it's an approach that despite our intentions, the impact is inherently racist. And winds up leaving equity deserving families less served than, for example, white families where we might be more inclined to have those conversations a little more fully. And so I would say that many families and communities are in a crisis, and our young people are in a crisis. Our 2S LGBTQ young people are in a crisis because their families don't have the support they need to help them understand and support their children. And that's an abdication of responsibility on a broader level, on a public policy level, where I don't see funding programs specifically designed to encourage applications to support families of 2S LGBTQ youth. And at an organizational level, it's so easy for social service organizations and child welfare agencies as well to focus on supporting the youth and not the family. And within our frontline practice, it's so easy to give up on the family. And so what I think we need is a radical turnaround and a radical investment of energy, of strategies, of funding, and of resources and intention to be there to support the families to learn to understand and support their 2S LGBTQ children. The Family Acceptance Project in the US has done a lot of research, has developed models on working with families, and their research finds that no matter how rejecting the family, and families of all different racial identities, cultural identities, all different levels of investment in faith, that all families have a really strong capacity to be able to learn to understand, accept, and support their children's identities. And when families do that, we see youth thrive. When families don't, that's when we have youth filling up emergency rooms, filling up mental health wards because of suicidality. That's when we see child welfare bringing more children into care. That's when we see young people struggling with depression, anxiety, substance misuse, eating troubles, self-harm, suicidality. Right now in Canada, 2/3 of trans youth seriously consider suicide every year. But when we look at what is the role of the family, and we look again at trans youth in an Ontario study, we found that trans youth who had very supportive families, only 4% made a suicide attempt within a year. But when trans youth did not have very supportive families, 57% made a suicide attempt within a year. That means that youth who don't have those supportive families are 14 times more likely to make a suicide attempt. And that puts our youth in crisis and our families in crisis. We know the answer, we need the will to do it.
Wow. Thank you, Lorraine. And thank you, Clovis. Cora, I think Cora may have dropped off.
Unfortunately, Cora is having technical difficulties, but why don't the three of you continue, and Cora
Okay.
can always join the second conversation after the break.
Thank you. So I have a couple questions for you, Cova and Lorraine. And this question, Lorraine, I'm just going to piggyback off of what you just spoke about. Can you give us some strategies of how can working with parents, caregivers, and families be of benefit to a young person struggling with mental health?
So we know that family support is the #1 protective factor for 2S LGBTQ youth. And we know that supporting their children's identities not only protects the youth from the risks, the terrible stats that we know are out there for 2S LGBTQ young people, but it also helps keep families together and keeps them strong. And that offers the best health and well-being options and long-term outcomes for our young people. And so just as an example, when we have a young person who is feeling suicidal and is so depressed because it feels like their family is never going to understand them and support them, we can work with that family. We can ask that question, those questions to our families. We can explore, coming back to the model that you talked about, Carol, we can explore families' values with them. We can help them link to the underlying love that we know they have for their child, and the best outcomes that they want for their child. We can expect that families have the capacity to shift and become more supportive. We don't need to give up on them. We can provide education with families about how the impact of their behavior and the things that they say lands for their children by centering the children's voices. You know, how does it land for you when your family tells you that you're a big disappointment to them because you've chosen this path that they think you could choose differently on? And then feeding that back with families. How do you understand that this is how it lands for your child, and the pain that they feel when they hear you say that, when I know that what you want to convey to your child is that you love your child? We can empower families to be able to choose their children and to say, I don't totally understand, I don't even totally agree, but I love you no matter what. I will hold you close to me. I will try and learn more and find out how I can understand and support you, but know that I love you and I'm not giving up. We can help families to say that, and that is what is going to help our young people.
Thank you, Lorraine. Some really good tips there. Thank you so much. Clovis, I'm going to switch for lines for a little bit and ask you, what are the lessons for educators and youth workers on being an ally to parents and caregiver? Given that you do so much work with the caregivers, what are some of the lessons that we could take away in terms of being an ally and working effectively with parents and caregivers?
I think one of the main things sorry, that we hear from families is that lack of, and I can use the word partnership, and between the school system and home. Often we see the struggle in that the parents have all this information and knowledge and how to support their child, but then they hit many barriers with the school systems, and it's as if the school is saying, we know how to do this. This is how we're going to do it. Well, that may not actually work for the parents. So really that collaboration, and I think the second piece is making families more aware of their rights. Just as a reference point, I sat on the Special Education Advisory Committee with the Toronto District School Board for about 10 years. And one of the things that we really worked on and just really helping the board to understand is the importance of making sure that families know their rights. And I'm talking specifically about families caring for somebody with a disability whose kids are coming to special education programs. But often you get the battle because the school is, or the system, as we call it, is saying one thing. Parents don't actually know what's available to them, and they end up having to hear it from other parents or other individuals or sources, and not directly from the school. So I think that's where, again, partnership really comes in, and respecting the parents, that they have a right to know, and if you're working together, it's not meant to be cantankerous. It's meant to be working together, because really the child needs to be at the center.
Thank you, Clovis. And one of the things too that you said that triggered me was also moving away from using jargons and high level terminologies that parents don't understand. And it's about also calling parents into conversation rather than calling them out or pushing them away, right? And calling someone into conversation is really talking about like really breaking down things for parents and caregivers, because a lot of these institutions and systems are foreign to our caregivers, right? Of equity deserving family. So thank you both Lorraine and Clovis for sharing. I have one question that I would like you both to answer. What are the concrete action that some of the folks could take away? Just one or two things from what you do and all the amazing research and work you do with equity deserving population, whether they're children with disability, whether they're young people, 2S LGBTQ young people, whether there's people, it's caregivers who are living in poverty, it's whether there's complete caregivers who are living with different intellectual abilities. What are the one thing that you would have people take away in terms of how to work effectively with these equity deserving families or caregivers and their families?
I'll just have to echo what I said with the school system. I think broadly speaking, that parents have a lot of say and need to have a lot of say and be treated as partners. I think that the expert model where parents aren't the experts really just needs to be, that we need to be reminded that parents want to be engaged, can be engaged, have what it takes, but they need support. And when we silence their voices, when we don't recognize some of the challenges that they have to be able to support their families, and that's really what we're trying to do, is give parents that space where they can feel empowered to use their voice, because they have a lot and can contribute a lot. But I think often we put so many barriers in their way, and so they end up having to either fight or they just flee and just give up, which does not, neither benefits their child. Well, maybe fighting sometimes does benefit, but it's just exhausting for parents to have to deal with so much. But if they're treated as partners, as experts in their child's life, it just makes it a better space for them, for everybody to see the improvements and in outcomes for their young one.
Thank you. And this is not your suggestions. It's not only for the school board. It's for people within the child welfare sector. It's for people who are within the youth sector. It's for people within the mental health sector. So thank you so much for sharing that, Clovis. And I'll pass it on to you, Lorraine. What's your one thing that you would like people to leave with from your perspective?
You know, I think we've talked a little bit about how the model that you shared earlier can be applied when working with families. But there's a piece that I feel is just missing in so much of what the literature talks about and what happens, I think, in services, and that's how intersectionality and the historical and ongoing system of white supremacy impacts so many different communities. And obviously the impact on Black communities and Indigenous communities and other racialized communities is absolutely profound. But we don't think about the impact on 2S LGBTQ communities and on and on young people's families, and particularly if young people hold intersecting identities themselves. But it was really through this process of invasion, colonization, transatlantic enslavement, and forced migration. This is where all of these ideas that people need to be heterosexual and that their internal sense of gender must agree with the sex assigned at birth, these were all wrapped up in racist ideology that was transported all across the world. And so, for example, we see that among the countries around the world now that that hold laws that would make homosexuality illegal. 50% of those come directly from British colonization. So these processes of white supremacy have erased the histories from all around the world where gender and sexual diversity was normalized and existed. And we're seeing so much more evidence about how gender and sexual diversity existed everywhere around the world, and yet that knowledge has been stripped from us. And when we can go back to those roots of knowledge, that's what allows us to challenge some of the tension that we see now. Well, you know, this is just a white Western thing that my child has picked up from friends at school, and the internet doesn't have anything to do with who my child is. And yet that those notions that we have all learned really come attached along to piggybacking onto the ways that white supremacy have been propagated all around the globe.
Very impactful. Thank you, Clovis. Thank you, Lorraine. I'm going to pass it back to Kate because I think we're going to be taking a break, a wellness break now, Kate, and we'll hear from Lorraine and Clovis again towards the end of our presentation. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we really appreciate being able to hear from you all, and we will have another conversation. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, Angie Morris, who was supposed to be part of this first conversation, was not able to join us for today's event, and Cora MacDonald was experiencing some technical difficulties, so we hope that she will be back to join us very soon. We are going to transition to a bit of a break. Before we do, we do have a question that we want to ask you that is something that our guests so far, our speakers have been sharing. We want to know how you center equity in your work with families, and we have some YouthREX swag that we are excited to share with you. We have notebooks and pens and water bottles and tote bags, and we hope that you will share how you center equity in your work with families in the chat box. And then what we'll do is the first 5 people to submit their response in the chat box will be contacted to receive a YouthREX gift bag, just a little treat from us to you. Typically at our events, when they are in person, we come together around food. And so we're not able to nourish you in that way, but we do want to share something with you, and in gratitude for your being here. So if you want to share in the chat box one way in which you center equity in your work with families, as I said, we will award a gift bag to the first 5 people who share a practice with us. And there will be more opportunities after the break for you to share some of your strategies in your work with families. So we'll look forward to that. It's 1:50. Why don't we aim to come back at 2 o'clock? Carol, does that sound good to you?
Yes, 2 o'clock sounds excellent. Thank you.
Yes, so please take care of yourselves, take a break, have some water, stretch, step away from your screens, and we will see you back here at 2 o'clock. Thank you so much, everyone. Welcoming everyone back to our conversation on centering equity in family engagement. Thank you again for being with us. I hope everyone was able to take a little time for themselves as we move into this last hour of our time together today. We're going to start with an interactive activity. We've all had some time today to hear about the 4 E's framework, not only understanding the framework, but also understanding how it can be applied to practice. And so what we'd like to do is provide everyone with an opportunity to share some of their practices. I know folks have already shared with us today some of their practices for centering equity, and folks have shared a lot of different practices with us around how they do this work in their work with families. But we want to provide another opportunity for engagement. So I'm going to share my screen, and we're also going to share a link with you so that you can access this Google Jam board. So we're going to share that in the chat box as well. And we're going to encourage you all to participate by joining the board. Sorry, give me one moment to pull up the link. And I will make sure post it in the chat box so you all can see, so that you can all join in. There you go. So we invite you to join the Jam board. We have 4 boards. So you'll be able to, if you see your screen, you'll be able to click through the boards with these arrows at the top of the screen. And we have 1 board for each of the 4 E's, which are titled accordingly. And we're going to invite you to share your practices by adding a sticky note. And so if everyone can see the screen that I'm sharing, there's a menu at the left-hand side. And one of these options is a sticky note. This option right here. You click on it, you enter your practice, and you save it, and it will add to the board. And we encourage everyone to share some practices around how they understand the 4 E's framework in their practice, applying to their work with parents, caregivers, and families. And we'll just give folks a few minutes. Feel free to navigate between the boards. If you want to repurpose one of the practices you've already shared throughout today's conversation, we encourage you to do that. And we'll just take a couple of minutes as folks are returning from the break to ask you to share some of your practices, and everyone will have access to this board. So hopefully this is another way that we can learn and share with one another.
And Katie, would we be able to get access after the seminar? Would folks be able to get access to this?
Yes, this is now an open board that everybody has access to, so they can continue sharing and adding and learning even beyond this conversation. Does anyone have any questions about how to navigate the board before I stop sharing my screen? Because if not, we'll just keep that open now, and folks can share throughout the session going forward. And again, after today, we'll make sure that this link is also in the email that you'll all receive after the session with today's resources, so you can access it going forward. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen then. Everyone has access to the link. We'll make sure to share that so that you can see the different sticky notes that people have added. And I'm going to turn it back over to Carol for our next conversation. And we're going to invite David and Debbie and Jordan and Cora to join us for this conversation. So if you want to turn on your cameras, turn off your mics, and we'll make sure to spotlight everybody.
Thank you, Cora. I think we're waiting for a couple people to put on the camera, I think, but we'll get started. Just want to reiterate, it's my privilege to be here with you guys, and thank you folks for being here to share your practice knowledge. I know you all have a wealth of experience that you can share, because we all want to focus on better outcomes for the families, the best possible outcomes for the family we work with. So Cora, I'll turn it over to Cora, and everyone would have about 5 minutes to talk about who they are and what they do. So Cora, can I turn that over to you, please?
Hi, everyone. Yeah, thanks, and apologies. My power went out, but I'm back online. Yeah, welcome everyone. It's a delight to be here with you today. My name is Cora MacDonald. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a researcher with the Making the Shift Youth Homelessness Demonstration Lab. This lab is helping to transform how we respond to youth homelessness in Canada through research and knowledge mobilization. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about one of our demonstrations projects called the Youth Reconnect program, which is a community-based program for young people aged 13 to 24 who are at risk of homelessness. Youth Reconnect provides communities with an upstream response, so one that prioritizes helping young people strengthen connections with schools, family, and community as a way to ensure young people maintain safety, stability, well-being, rather than being left to fall through the cracks and rely on emergency and crisis response systems. So what does Youth Reconnect have to do with engaging equity deserving families? Often when we think about young people experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness, we assume that they don't have a family or maybe would be better off without their family. Why? Well, for one, research does show that breakdowns in family and relationships between young people and their parents is one of the primary drivers of young people becoming homeless in the first place. And so with that, if families are often seen as part of the problem, and therefore solutions are often focused on helping young people who are experiencing homelessness or at risk of to become self-sufficient and independent, often from their families. This was certainly my assumption when I began doing research with young people, which is why I was actually struck in interviews and research interviews with young people when they shared, when they started discussing actually how important some of their family relationships were. And to me, I started to think about actually, for many young people, there seemed to be a compelling presence of family and as defined by that young person. So family could mean a lot of different things. And with that, it caused me to start to challenge and rethink our assumptions that, you know, families always detrimental or part of the problem, and to start to rethink how we could think about the role of family in any work being done to address youth homelessness. So the Youth Reconnect program does try to flip this thinking. It operates with the underlying ethos that family, however defined by a young person, is important, and that a truly effective response to preventing young people from becoming homelessness must consider opportunities to reconcile relationships, repair, or strengthen these. This work can be challenging and complex, and requires that we address a few assumptions or unpack them. So first, you know, how do young people create and maintain these connections, and with who? So who are these connections, and how are these relationships being maintained? And then the second consideration that WIRE looks to address is how can service providers help strengthen these relationships? The WIRE program does this by seeking ways to support young people in understanding, navigating, and strengthening vital connections, however defined by a young person. Some supports include help mediating conflicts, strengthening relationships with parents, and nurturing natural supports to help young people move forward in their lives, to stay in school and to remain in their community. To do this work effectively, we need to work with both young people and the families, ensure that they're equipped with all the tools necessary. What this means in practice is that family members are actually considered participants in the program as well as the young people. Ultimately, meeting the needs of both young people and family requires that we advance approaches which are centered on the visions, voices, strengths, and agency of young people, and determining their well-being and honoring their contributions as helpers and not helpless. This ties back to the importance of self-agency in the framework shared by Carol. And finally, an important part around this when we're looking at empowerment and self-agency is that recognizing that strengthening connections with young people at risk of homelessness or potentially experiencing it doesn't necessarily mean that young people have to have the goal of returning home. It means that when the program ends, that a successful program will have helped young people to create boundaries that work for them within and in relation to their family and natural supports. Thank you.
Thank you, Cora. It's Interesting program. Looking forward. I see that Kate has posted in the chat a link to your program. Looking forward in learning more about the demonstration lab. So thank you. So I'll pass it on to Debbie Miles Senior, please. Introduce yourself.
Thank you, Dr. Wade. It was really great to hear you speak. Lots of information that I'm definitely going to take away from my organization. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Debbie Miles Senior, and I'm currently the director for Durham Family and Cultural Center, formerly Side by Side Family Center. We're located here in Durham. And some of the work that we do include our SFA, or Student Family Advocate, or Together We Are program, and our currently Promoja program, which means together. And I'll just speak a little bit more on that, but just to give you a background of who I am a born Jamaican. I've been here for a while. I am a parent. I've worked with parents for a very, very long time. If I give a number, I'll sort of be aging myself right now, so I'll leave it as that. One of the things that really stands out for me when I was listening to everyone on the platform is just where my path to, supporting families and what it looks like. As a born Jamaican and being here in Canada, I came to Canada when I was fairly young. And I came here to my sister, and I worked with children aids, but prior to that, I was a child in care. So that shaped my image of what, racism is in Canada and just the system. I was really forced to acknowledge that at a very young age, being forced from foster home and being in the CAS system. I eventually worked in the system in CAS. And one of the things that really stood out for me while working there was the uniqueness of family and not being a family, not having the opportunity, as Dr. Wade talked about, is just the equity in really looking at families from their strength, from their culture, unpacking our own biases. And so while I worked in the system, and I was part of that system, I walked into families with my own biases and my own cultural biases on what families should look like. And so while I work in the system, I realized that something needs to change. And, we talked about changing the system of CAS and all the other system, is that the change starts now, right? And so while working in there, I was like, okay, this has to look different around access and how families connect with their children. And so out of that was born, I created an access center called Side by Side Supervised Access. And the goal of it was to just allow families to be where they're at, to be, for us as practitioners and staff, to really work with families from where they're at. And when I look at the four E's, what really stands out for me was the empowerment. And so that was one of the things we really wanted to do, let families be their voice, because they are the stories for their lives. And so creating the side-by-side access services really allowed families to have a connection with their children. And so presently, back to, as I said, I am the director here at Durham Family and Cultural Center. And our goal is really to give families a voice and children a voice and empowerment, because we know, as we know, anti-racism still exists. And so our goal here is to empower family and give them a voice. So that's where we're at right now. We've been very fortunate here at Durham Family and Cultural Center that we have a great board and just families and staff, and really looking at the work that we do every day and really examining our own biases as we do our work. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. I'm going to pass it on to Jordan.
Thank you, Dr. Wade, and hello, everyone. It is such a privilege to be here in this virtual space with you all. I feel like I'm just soaking in so much. It's such a lovely opportunity. So my name is Jordan. I coordinate a program called Families in Transition, and that's a program that runs out of CTYS, or the Central Toronto Youth Services. And the program is primarily focused on supporting parents or caregivers or significant adults in a youth's life who have recently found out about the youth's gender identity, which is like a long-winded way to say that we like work with adults who have youth in their life who are exploring gender or have recently come out as trans or gender diverse or gender questioning. And I guess like a little bit of the context around that is that I've been like working in trans communities for like almost 20 years now. I'm also a trans person, and I'm also a parent. I'm also a parent of a trans youth. So I come with all those lenses. But like back in the day, like in the early 2000s, when I was just coming out, the context of services for trans youth at the time were really that like kind of like Lorraine talked about before the break. Like services were available for trans youth, not in the context of their family. So often young people were moving away from home, having to make this sort of like fundamental choice between living authentically and, you know, as themselves in the world, or maintaining a connection with their family. And it was very, very rare that you would be lucky enough to have both. And so the vast majority of young people that were accessing services at the time didn't have that support network, and were often, you know, navigating the shelter system, or like coming up on all these barriers because of that. And there were some beautiful things that came out of that as well. Like something that's very common in queer and trans communities is this idea of chosen families. I think lots of communities understand that concept where, you know, family becomes the people that you make it, that you choose your family in that way. And I think that idea is so powerful and so beautiful and so relevant still. We also are seeing that like there's a real value as well in working more and more with families of origin. So I think what I wanted to talk about a little bit in just framing the program is that I think that there is something so beautiful, honestly, about the way that we work with parents, because the parents that we see in our group are seeking out our services because they really want to connect with their youth, but they're kind of doing a shit job at it. I think that this very powerful thing that we offer them is like an opportunity to be really heard in their fears and their anxieties. And so I think that like the piece that's really important for me about an equity lens is this piece around abolition. And for me, abolition means recognizing that like the systems that we work within are often based on this idea of punishment. So if you don't do things in a particular way, then you are punished. Like the education system works that way, the criminal justice system works that way, the children's mental health sector works that way a lot of the time. And so we don't approach parents in that way. I think that we sort of try and create this space where we say like it is possible that, well, we know that your young person is experiencing discrimination, and there's a high likelihood that they're experiencing discrimination inside the house, that you are probably contributing to the discrimination that they're facing. And we're not going to penalize you for that. We're going to explore that with you so that we can transform it, because our ultimate goal is to eradicate that discrimination, that violence that trans and gender diverse and two-spirit young people are experiencing in their houses. And I think also by being a program that's a by-for program, where it's trans and gender diverse and two-spirit spirit people facilitating the work as well, there opens up this really cool opportunity for parents to trust us and for us to build allyship with parents so that they're able to really examine discrimination in a critical way, and not fall apart with it and not feel, criticized, or that their parenting values are being criticized, but really feel like they're able to move through hardness and come back and do like profound and meaningful repair with their kids. So yeah, that's a little bit about the program. And so I guess like out of the 4 E's that you described so brilliantly, Dr. Wade, the one that spoke to me the more was the one around exploration. I think that like parents often come to the group being like, yes, I guess I'm okay with trans people abstractly, but that's not my child. That's not their path. I don't want that for them. And I think that through sort of like arts-based and embodied practices, we can show parents how negative messages sort of happen in the world. Like what are these negative messages that trans youth are often, hearing about themselves on the daily, and how are they contributing to those messages either unconsciously or unintentionally? And I think that exploration pieces can be so meaningful for parents and really transformative. So yeah, I will end there.
Thank you so much for sharing your work. A lot of great work that you and Cora both doing. And Debbie, final but not least, Mr. Grant, David, I'll turn the mic over to you now.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So yes, like everybody has said, it's an honor to be here, to be able to be in this space for me to shed, not only my knowledge, but to also receive a lot of knowledge from the very knowledgeable people on this call, from certainly you, Dr. Wade, and of the nuggets of wisdom that I've taken mental note of. So it's great to be here and to be able to engage in this dialogue. So my name is David Grant, and I work as a social worker, therapist, psychotherapist. I go by various titles depending on whom you talk to. So in some cases, healer, right? Because that's also the work that that I do in the mental health realm. I work at CAMH in the substance abuse program for African, Caribbean, and Canadian youth. Also, or better known more affectionately as SAPACCY, right? The SAPACCY program, which has been around since the mid to late 90s and has always been grounded in community, specifically the Black African diaspora community, and since transitioned into being housed within CAMH, but that community focus has never been extinguished, right? It has been a program that's been grounded in Africentric principles, which I will elaborate on, as well as racial trauma-informed principles. And a reason I really want to bring in those two specific principles is this is inherently what centers and what grounds our program. So when we start with Africentric, oftentimes this term is thrown around and people may have this very general idea of what it is. But if I can be very specific in terms of what it is, it's taking the African-centered worldview, and it's not as if there's one worldview, but it's understanding that the philosophies, the ideologies, the value systems, the behavioral patterns of Black people across this globe are grounded in fundamental similarities with the respective nuances and the respective different cultures. I mean, Africa itself has like over tens of thousands of ethnicities. I think in the Congo alone is over 200 ethnicities. So to say there's one sole homogeneous African identity is absolutely preposterous. However, there are fundamental similarities that are encompassed in this idea of the Afrocentric worldview, how we greet each other, what we recognize as families, how we speak, this idea of always centering everything in spirituality. I've worked with Black people throughout the diaspora, from Kenya, from Sierra Leone, from Jamaica, from Trinidad, from Brazil, you name it, I've worked with it. And it doesn't matter whom I talk to, there is always this very fundamental similarity in terms of how we speak, how we greet each other, the foods we make, etc. So when we say Afrocentric, at least when I say Afrocentric and people I would assume of like-minded, this is what we mean. And it's taking that and putting it at the center, not at the peripheral. Oftentimes when we have these different initiatives, it's the Eurocentric as well as, but we're removing that. we're saying, okay, Eurocentric if we're working with those of European descent as an example, but if we're working with African people, taking Africentric and putting it here. If we're working with Chinese people, it's taking the Chinese understandings of things and putting it in the center so we understand who we're working with. And the reason I explain that is that when we're working with youth who are experiencing mental health distress or even to the extreme illness, right? We have to understand it from that various lens of being grounded in their indigenous identity as African people, as well as understanding what has triggered this, which fundamentally is racism and everything else that is on top of that, right? And when we're working with our youth who are experiencing these crises as it relates to these psychological detriments, we cannot discount families. And this is what we say when we're saying we're grounded in the community. That's exactly what we're talking about. We're grounded in helping our youth who are experiencing these crises and understanding it's not solely them who are experiencing these crises. It's their families experiencing these crises. It's their community experiencing these crises. If you have somebody get shot in a neighborhood, you can't just solely work with the person who witnessed the shooting and the person who was the victim of the shooting. You have to work with the families who live next door to the shooting. You have to work with the parents who have parented that child in some capacity, who have been influenced by that shooting. So when we're talking about what is influencing the mental illness among some of our Black youth, because our program specifically focuses on youth ages 14 to 24, although we do make exceptions, unfortunately, because of the disparity of programs when it comes to addressing this. When we are working with these youth, we're not just working with them by themselves. I've, run sessions where I've had, the client come in and ask if their brother can come in. I've had clients ask and say, hey, can my boy come in? This is my really good friend. He's like a brother to me. And while I'm treating the one youth, I end up almost indirectly treating the other youth, because he's like, well, I was there for the shooting as well. And I've also had nightmares. I've also experienced paranoia. I also, haven't been able to tell my parents about the trauma that I've experienced because I don't know how they're going to react. So I end up actually working with these youth in that way. And then when I get calls from the families, because they're saying my child is experiencing this, I don't know how to work with them, I incorporate them into the treatment plan as well. And so we, us at SAPACCY, we understand when we're working with youth who are experiencing mental health crises, when we're working with youth who are trying to heal, who are trying to understand, from the Africentric lens, we're understanding that they're not just trying to heal from that specific illness that they're experiencing. It's not just the bipolar that they're trying to manage. It's not just the schizophrenia or even the first episode of psychosis that they're trying to understand or heal from, or really trying to get a grapple with. It's understanding their whole self-concept that has oftentimes been affected by various other external factors. It's helping them to better understand themselves, because what we understand when we're talking about healing from an African-centered or an Afrocentric lens, one of the fundamental things is self-knowledge, self-worth, and self-love, right? It's very difficult to heal from any illness if you don't understand and are aware of who you are, right? Especially when we're talking one psychological in nature. And this is what we understand. And this is how we work with families, where we help them to understand that your child is experiencing this, and this is how you manage it. And also helping them understand that you actually may know about this, but maybe are not familiar with the language that's used to describe this, right? Sometimes we have terms, for instance, in our respective dialects that actually describe mental health phenomena. But because it's not being described in that way, oftentimes we feel, or even sometimes service providers think that they're talking to people who are, lack of a better word, incompetent or not knowledgeable about mental health and mental illness. So we think, oh, we have to provide psychoeducation. No, maybe you need to use different language, right? Maybe you need to describe it in spiritual terms. Maybe you need to use the words that they're more familiar with. Maybe you need to understand, how do you understand mental health? Oftentimes we don't even ask Black families. We assume. Lorraine talked about, even when it comes to supporting youth on the 2S LGBTQ plus spectrum, we assume Black families are not going to be supportive. And this assumption comes from this idea that that many Black families, whether it's their children, in this case, children experiencing mental health crises, are not only willing to support their youth unconditionally, but they also lack the knowledge. Right. And there's almost this very looming racist undertone of why they lack the knowledge? Is it because they lack the inability to understand mental health, as if it's this very far-fetched custom that only those who are white of European descent can understand and therefore educate others on, right? Why is it that we make the assumption that Black people don't understand? Maybe if we take the approach that maybe they understand it, but in a different way, we actually may have different results. And this is what we understand in our program. This is part of the work that I do. I don't just do the therapy for the youth. So we also do a lot of psychoeducation in a culturally appropriate way for our families. We do it for the community. So not just the specific families, but also for other families alike who are experiencing this. So that's really understanding the Africentric basis of the SAPACCY program. Now, the racial trauma-informed basis, when we're understanding what has, how youth have been affected, or how they're being affected by racism and how it's informing their mental health and mental illness, as well as their families, right? Is understanding fundamentally that racism as a system and the symptoms of racism. I like to say that because when we think of those who are promoting Nazism, that's not the epitome of racism, that's a symptom, right? The police brutality is a symptom, right? To uphold the white social order of keeping those who are white of European descent on top and everybody else at the bottom. Everything else are symptoms, right? But it's understanding this is all part of the order. When we look at how that affects not only the youth, but the families, we start to see the ripple effect, right? We start to see how family customs have been warped by slavery, have been warped by colonialism. So when we look at, for instance, why certain mothers are upheld, is because of the matriarchal systems from Africa, but that has also been warped by slavery as an instance, because fathers were removed from the home, because they were placed aside at the peripheral. So it's this warped, almost carryover from Africa, but at the same time, it's a warped system because men were further excluded and the burden was placed on the mothers, right? And then you throw in patriarchy, where there's now this almost degradation of the women in these households. So when you throw in even spirituality when it talks about mental health and mental illness, because that's a big thing when it comes to helping working with our youth as it relates to understanding mental health and mental illness with the families, because sometimes the barriers, you have families who are really trying to take a very religious approach when it comes to understanding mental health, and the youth feel like their parents are dismissing it, feel like their parents are minimizing it. It's, again, not trying to completely exclude the idea of spirituality, because some of these youth say, no, spirituality is important. It's important to me. I've had some, for instance, Somali Muslim youth who say, no, we don't need to scrap spirituality, because they've had some service providers say, okay, yeah, we don't have to look at it from a religious standpoint. They're like, I'm not saying that. All I'm saying is I want my mom to understand that it may be also more than just me needing to go to the mosque, or me needing to read the Quran, or me needing to read the Torah or the Bible. I'm not discounting that. But this is where the imposition of the dominant paradigm that excludes the idea of spirituality with mental illness comes in. So I say all that to say, this is what we try to do, is try to help our families understand that you can incorporate both, but it's understand that racism has really impacted how we understand, how we implement that with our families. And this is our program. So look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, David. Very informative. So I'm going to throw out some questions to the group. And I have a number of questions, but I don't think time will permit, because I really want to give our participants some time to ask questions of all of us. So, but I have two questions that I'm going to throw out. The first one is the word support is often used in our work, but it can be so vague. What do we mean when we talk about support for parents or caregivers? What does support mean to you, and what does it look like in your practice? So I'll open the floor for anyone who wants to answer that question. If not, I'm going to call on someone. Okay, how about I just call on someone? Debbie.
What does support means to me in my practice is really to enhance the tools that a parent already has, that a family already have. It's to really walk alongside the family, to really celebrate a family's skills, abilities, and to really help the family to just get where they need to get to based on where the family's at. So that's what support means. It's not, for me, it's, you know, as you said, we generally use that word, we support family, we support our youth. But it's also what it means, as I said, for me, in my practice, as I really look at a family, when I meet with the families, I look at their strengths. I celebrate what they do. I often hear as a Jamaican, and parents will often say, I don't want my kids to turn out how much I had to struggle. I don't want my kids to be like this. And so often when I start my practice in meeting with families, and I hear that, especially Caribbean families, and I always just say, but look how far you've come. Look what you've done. So celebrate that. And that's the support, because you're lifting the family along with them. So that's what it means for me in my practice.
Thank you, Debbie. Jordan, the same question.
Thanks so much. Yeah, just want to echo so much of what Debbie just said. I guess on top of that, like what support for us in the program means, like what support for parents means is, I think, like clarifying their role, and I think, like, what is the support for parents? Like, I think that parents come in to our group and they like are, I think most parents are operating from a place of really wanting what is best for their kids. Yeah, I think it can be like a really hard realization to like understand the ways that like these unconscious biases that we carry around, like who trans people are also impacting our relationships with our kids. Like parents are often holding a lot of fear around what it's going to mean for their kid to move through the world in the ways that they are, and are also coming in with a lot of fear around and I think a lot of it is just like general stuff around like being a parent of a youth. Like there's a lot of things that you need to let go of when you are like having a young person that is, you know, they're individuating. Like there's a lot of things that you can't control. Yeah, but we really can control what happens within the relationships. And so yeah, our support is really around like providing them with a pathway back to their kids, especially in this context where they're feeling like really alienated and really like they don't know anything. I think that there's often like a bit of a cultural divide between like queer and trans people and their families of origin. The like queer community and trans communities are like often when you talk to young people that grow up in a household, there's a bit of like a cultural split there. And so I feel like a lot of our support is also in like connecting families across that divide.
Thank you so much. Thank you, and Jordan. And my last question to the group, as I said, I want to leave some time for our participants to ask us questions. So my last questions for the group, and this is, I'm going to direct it to David and Cora to be specific. In what ways is a youth in distress possible a symptom of a family in distress? Okay, so I'll turn it to whoever wants to go first. Please go ahead.
Sure, I'll start. So I touched upon, so I'll just give a bit more insight. I'll ensure to be concise. I want to allow lots of time for questions. So what are ways, just to make sure I understand the question correctly, to see how if a youth being in distress may actually also be a symptom of a family being in distress?
Yeah. Perfect.
Very good. First and foremost is asking, right? When I'm meeting with the youth, first thing that I want to do is to ask what's going on. Always do a check-in, but the check-in is not just a check-in with them, it's check-in with everything that's going on. How's the family? My check-ins are always, I try to be as, as holistic as possible. Check-in with how their physical health is going, how their family's doing, you know, how school is going, etc. And see what insight is gathered there. And oftentimes you will start to get some insight into, for instance, if there was a divorce in the family, right? You'll start to you'll see the youth, you know, maybe if they already struggle with anxiety, they're visibly feeling, you know, appearing more anxious than usual. And when you start to gather that, you start to realize it's not solely the divorce that may be the issue, it's the fact that maybe one of the parents is taking it really hard, is much harder than maybe the other parent, or maybe it's the fact that both parents had gone away and they're staying with their grandmother and they miss their parents terribly, and maybe the parent doesn't know how to express themselves, and maybe they lashed out on the child because they heard the child isn't doing well in school. So you see the ripple effect, but you don't know if you don't ask. And oftentimes we just work with the youth and we say, okay, the youth is anxious, so we need to help the youth. But sometimes when we realize, oh wait, maybe it's the family. Sometimes if the family's in town, I'll say, you know, why don't we get everybody in to have a family session, even if it's one, right? You don't know if you don't ask. And so really it starts with asking, and then also starts with reaching out then and talking with the parents, and but in order to do all of that is to have a relationship with them. And when we're talking Africentric forms of being, of understanding, relationships are top of the priority, not your knowledge of the modalities, not the knowledge of the different ways to help treat. It's the relationship, because you can do nothing else until the relationship is formed and solidified. So that's how I deal with that.
I like that. You can't do anything until a relationship is formed and solidified. I think I'm going to write that down by David Grant.
There you go. I haven't copyrighted it yet, so you're good.
Thank you. Cora, I'm going to pass it over to you first.
Yeah, thanks. No, it's a great question. I think certainly within, like our programs and my research work, I think I mentioned this, that sometimes it's, family can be seen as part of the problem, or potentially one of the main reasons young people become homeless. But there's also a number of other reasons. So we think poverty, mental illness, often people are in distress. And I think what the Youth Reconnect program is really trying to do is to show that it's often collective experiences. So to limit that and say, oh, it's, that the family hasn't gone through this too, is sometimes what we've done, and we're missing a bigger picture. So when we're looking for solutions, I think, you have to look to the family, and to David's point as well. It's talking and listening. As a researcher, I look at symptoms, but probably the richest piece of experience I have is collecting stories. So listening to people, hearing what's going on, and a lot comes out. And then my job is trying to, lay out that code for others to understand. And so with this work, we're starting to see that, to see how are these things interconnected.
Thank you, Cora. And just before I bring the other guests in and highlight everyone to answer questions, just 30 seconds. One thing people could take away from your experience in your talk. David, go ahead. 30 seconds.
My experience in my talk?
Yeah, one thing that we can take away from your experience or your talk about centering the well-being of equity and engaging effectively with equity-deserving families. Okay,
beautiful. One thing, relationships. If you want to do anything, and I'll speak, of course, from my point of reference being with Black families, of course, Black youth in particular, you have to have a relationship with them. If there's one thing that I've seen across the spectrum, Black youth, whether they're in post-secondary, whether they're working professionals, or whether they're, in the hood, gangbanging or selling drugs, relationship is key. If they don't feel you well, if they don't think that you are, as they would say, keeping it real, they're not going to engage. You're not going to get any treatment done. So you need to put everything aside and work on developing relationships with Black youth and their families. And then you will start to see progress. So relationships is key, fundamental.
And where what you said just fit in is in the exploration phase of
Very good.
Yes. So thank you, David. Cora?
Sure. Yeah, thanks. I think challenging assumptions. So I think, the assumption, for example, that family is always part of the problem with young people experiencing homelessness, challenging that, because when if you limit to that and think of it as the whole story, there's you miss a lot of opportunities for how it can be part of the solution and moving forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Cora. And I think your challenges could either fit in the exploration or the education piece of the framework. So thank you. Debbie?
Hi. For me, it's check your biases. Every time you walk into a home, whether culture, because for example, it's not, as I said, I'm Jamaican, it's not all Jamaican parent the same. So check your cultural biases when meeting with families. Be present, especially when working with youth, and ask questions. And also check the power imbalance, right? Families and youth are the experts in their lives. So it's always important when, you know, because oftentimes, I mean, we're human beings. And so we often walk into a home or work with a family and we'll say, you're giving your child that for dinner? Why are you going to give your child that for dinner? That's not what you're supposed to do. We automatically, it's an automatic unconscious bias that we usually put forward, and sometimes we don't even recognize it. So my thing is, make that be the forefront of your toolkit. Check your biases, celebrate families, and, you know, acknowledge in where they've come from. And as David put it so eloquently, is really build that relationship.
Thank you, Debbie. And I just really want to highlight self-reflection and self-reflexivity practice is so important. And if anyone took the certificate course on centering the well-being of youth, I did a lecture on self-reflexivity practice, and they actually provide a step-by-step on how you enter into self-reflexivity with families. So thanks, Debbie. The last but not least, Jordan.
Thanks so much. So yeah, I think that the takeaway that I would suggest from mine is like, if you're working with 2S LGBTQIA youth and you're not working with their families, then I would really encourage you to start working with the families. I think that there's often still this idea that like to be queer or trans in and of itself produces more negative mental health outcomes. And even though like most providers don't outwardly say that, I think almost all of the families that I see are coming in with that idea sort of embedded in how they're approaching this. They like want an easier pathway for their child. They think that like being trans would be fine if like no other option was possible, and embedded in that is like still this idea that like being trans or gender diverse in and of itself is going to cause those additional like mental health struggles, as opposed to like we live in this world that is not friendly or accepting, and often like young people are living in these families that are not friendly or accepting. So I think that like if we are centering equity, then we have to always be looking at those systemic factors. And there's this very cool thing that we get to do where we can say to parents that like, you actually have a huge role to play in this ripple out effect of making change in the world. And we can support you around that. And I think that we can also change the culture. And like I work with families. The families that I work with are actually not all marginalized like the youth are, but the families, like it's a multiracial group of families, right? Because our focus is the youth, it's not the families. And so I think that there's also some shifts that we can make in those spaces to be like, actually the families that are best equipped to support their young people around like navigating worlds that are not friendly for them are like families that experience discrimination and marginalization. Is often like cis het white families that struggle the most, because they're like, whoa, what is this thing that is discrimination? And so I think that there is some work around reshaping the conversation around that in those spaces as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Wonderful, lots of great information that I'm taking a lot of notes on too, so thank you. Katie, can I have you bring all the speakers back on and shine the light on all the speakers? And yeah. Please, Clovis, Lorraine, please put your cameras on if they're not on. That's great. And at this time, I'm going to open the floor for for any questions. Please feel free to put the question in the chat and to who the question is being directed to, or we would like to hear everyone's voices and see people who's here. So please feel free to use the raise your hand function and to ask any of us any questions. So I will open the floor now for questions. Were there any questions in the chat, Katie?
No, there's been a lot of sharing of practices and perspectives, but there haven't been any questions. And I wonder if any of you have questions for each other.
Yeah, I have a question. I have a question for Jordan. Jordan, can you just speak a bit more on, you've mentioned the word that the discrimination starts within, like shows up in the family. That was really a solid point. Can you just expand a bit on that? Like, what does it look like?
Yeah, totally. So I think for the most part, it happens in these like microaggressive ways. And so often when youth come out as gender diverse to their parents will have a reaction. Like it's very, very rare that parents are like, cool, and engaged and like affirming and supportive right off the bat. And the other thing that like often happens is like these sort of like small, like microaggressive moments that happen day in and day out that communicate particular messages to young people that their parents might also be reinforcing. So, you know, we do a lot of unpacking this through art in the group. Like, for example, like we'll talk about like if a young person goes to a school and there's nowhere safe for them to pee, what is the message that conveys? And so we'll really walk parents through it. Like the message could be, you don't matter, you don't belong here, we do not care enough about you to, you know, care about your safety. Like all of these messages are embedded in those moments, and those moments happen day in and day out and day in and day out. And so parents then also get an opportunity to look at the ways that like their approach, like if they say something like, you know, I guess it's fine if you're trans, but I don't want you to ever medically transition. Like that is too much, it's too scary. Like their intent is, I'm scared and I want to protect you, but the impact might be this message of, you know, I don't believe you, I don't trust you to make choices around your own body. You know, like all of those messages are often implied. And so we like support parents to gain some literacy around the ways that like they might be contributing to messages like that. Less common is like a more outwards, like you are wrong for being trans. Like it's often more subtle than that.
I'd like to ask David a question, and it ties it a little bit in with Cora's work as well. And of course, I'm in youth homelessness. So David, can you share some thoughts on your work and what families can do to prevent the number of Black youth from becoming homeless? Because we know that there is an overrepresentation of Black youth on the street. So can you comment on that, please?
Very good. So one important thing that families really have to do with their kids, whether it's, you know, whether it's because of experiencing very severe mental health crises, unfortunately, oftentimes related to psychosis or schizophrenia, full blown, or, you know, coming out on the 2S LGBTQIA+ spectrum, is they have to offer that unconditional love and support, and they have to have people to help them through it, right? Oftentimes families feel alone in this, and instead of speaking out about it or seeking out support, not always per se from people who are inherently going to encourage sometimes their behavior, but also seeking out just support in general, as we talked about, the support looking like helping that family navigate this, right? But still not trying to impose their views, because that's sometimes what the families fear is if they reach out for help, they think that they're going to have someone else's views imposed upon them, and they don't want to have to compromise some of their views. Maybe some of them they do, but it's feeling like I'm going to be judged in this, and all of that. So what we try to do is, when we have a youth, because we have some youth, for instance, who come into our program who are homeless, I'll ask them if they have contact with their family. And many of them oftentimes will say yes. But there's this fear that, I don't want to involve my family because I don't, we haven't really had it, we haven't talked in a while. And what we do is we try to bridge that gap. We say, okay, you know what, why don't we try to get your parents in and let's try to work this out, right? And I can speak from the mental health realm. We say, let's try to get your parents to understand this. So sometimes it's really bringing the parents to the table, because oftentimes they're still in the picture, but there is that fear of trying to reconcile with their families, whomever it may be, right? So what we try to do is, if we do have a youth who come in, we try to bridge that gap. And if we have youth, let's say, in the home who are already, there's that turmoil, we try to work with them, and not just, solely myself, but myself, the psychiatrist, and even other community workers. We try to bring everybody to the table to try to work with this family to understand what is happening, right? To try to really work from that beginning of the pipeline in order for that youth for us to not have to do that reconciliation work. And we don't mind it, but why not prevent it from even occurring, right? So this is what we try to do. And that's where the psychoeducation comes in, as it pertains to understanding things from a different lens. This is where we have the different stakeholders in the community helping to give their lens, the pastor, the imam, the community worker, whomever is at the table, to really help this family understand, you guys are not alone. We can work through this with you. So that's how we try to prevent some of these youth. And we have had some success where some youth were on the verge, and parents like, if this youth doesn't do this, I'm kicking them out. They don't take their medication, I'm kicking them out. Like, we don't have to go there, right? So we try to work with the parents from you giving that ultimatum, but we really meet them where I get where you're coming from, but this is also what the youth is coming from. How can we find a middle ground so that no one regrets doing either or? So that's what I would say. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I just want to take this opportunity to say to the panel, from the bottom of my heart, thank you guys for contributing to this conversation. Thank you for sharing your examples to support the 4 E's, which is empowerment, explore, education, and expectation. So thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here today on this platform and having this really important and urgent topic. I know while we spoke about specific equity deserving families, that the concepts that were discussion shared here by myself and the panel could be applied to almost any equity deserving families. So one of the things that I would like to ask everyone, and you don't have to answer this right here, but answer for yourself, what's the one simple thing that you're going to take away from this conversation that you're immediately going to put into practice? And I ask you for the one simple thing because there's a lot of information, a lot of discussion. We just spent the last 2.5 hours on here talking, a lot of information. So I want you to hone in until you could sit down and really reflect on everything you learned or heard today. I want you to just focus in right now on the one simple thing that you could take away and you could implement in your practice starting tomorrow, right? So I'll let you reflect on that. And again, I want to just thank you for being here for this important conversation and for taking time out of your busy schedule. And I know you're here because you want to do better in your work you're doing with equity deserving family. So thank you. And I'll turn it over to Katie for any last minute housekeeping things.
Yeah, no, thank you all so much on behalf of everyone at YouthREX and all of our attendees. We just want to thank you so much for sharing space with us and for sharing and learning with us I'm sharing in the chat box a link to a feedback form so you can share your experience of today's event. You will be receiving shortly an email with access to today's slides, to some resources on YouthREX's Knowledge Hub, as well as the Google Jamboard activity. There's been so much sharing, and I encourage you to save the chat from today's session. There's a lot of great practices that folks shared. So thank you again to all of our guests. Thank you so much to Carol for your leadership, your facilitation, and for bringing the 4E's framework to us all, and helping us to, confront our biases, our assumptions, and to really expand the ways in which we can practice and center equity in our youth, in our work with youth and with equity deserving families. So thank you all for being with us. We look forward to seeing you again at our next event, and we hope that you all have a fantastic day. Thank you all so much. Take care.